Well, exploration to try to answer that question. Keep in mind these 5 dilemmas. We'll come back to them at the end. 5 dilemmas of learning in global health around performance, scale and access, applicability, diversity, and complexity. Now, peer learning has always been there, all right? Learning from others, learning from people who are like yourself, it's always been there. It's always been important, but it's been limited to those within your physical space. Digital technologies then enable you to defy distance and boundaries in order to connect with others and learn from them. Now, recent advances in learning science remain largely unknown in global health, and at least in some quarters. What advances am I talking about? Well, 3 different kinds of learning that we need to understand in order to understand the power of peer learning, and that's social, networked, and digital learning. So what do we need to understand about digital learning? First things first, the 2 largest meta-analyses comparing online, blended, and face-to-face found no advantage to blended, to using both online and face-to-face learning, found that distance learning results have been consistently better, leveling for all other differences, and that's been the case since 1991. The only benefit of blended learning seems to be that people tend to do more work in those systems. Now, the problem then is elsewhere. It is in how we conceive of digital learning. You can see this view, and whether it's positive or negative, I'll let you be the judge, but there's a deep-rooted skepticism, fear, and dislike, rejection of online learning, of digital learning, of learning that is not happening in the way where that is fundamental to our existence, our lived reality in physical space. And that can be traced back to Plato, where that negative view of the written word, where writing detaches the message from its author, transforms it into a dead thing, a text. Well, that's what may be underpinning the sort of reluctance to engage or to recognize the value and significance of online learning. More recent example, this is 2012, Nathan Jurgensen writes about the constant interpenetration of online and offline, says it's a false dichotomy to distinguish between, to oppose our lived reality to the virtual one. The virtual one is lived also. It is also reality. It is lived rather than virtual. So we want to think about that as we go through. Now, second point is about network learning. And this is about learning architecture. So it doesn't have anything to do per se with the medium, with the digital medium in particular. This is a classroom in 1983 in Greece, a very specific learning architecture. Children are lined up in rows. They do not speak to each other. The teacher sits at the front. You're supposed to read your text and learn. Sophia here is daydreaming, and it gets even worse when she tries to engage with her fellow learners. Now, it's very easy to find similar learning architecture in humanitarian development and global health context. This is a livelihoods training in Sri Lanka in 2006. And this didactic learning architecture is something we know and actually are intimately comfortable with. We've all experienced it, whether as teacher or student. And yet we know that when it comes to fostering leadership and collaboration, it's a different type of architecture that we need, that we're going to need. And here are many examples from humanitarian and global health work. In Afghanistan, in Kenya, you can see some kind of interactive exercise here where learners are engaged. You can see here there's a round circular architecture. Again here, a very different configuration from that formal classroom. And here, when we look at something like first aid training, then it's most obvious what the differences are. That sort of learn by doing, that practice-based learning forces us to adopt a different learning architecture. Here's some more examples. Now, think about what learning architecture peer learning requires and what are the benefits, advantages of that, why that could be important with respect to the challenges that we're and problems that we're tackling in global health. Third is social learning, right? And this is the fact that peer learning is about making human connections. And this is especially important in a world of knowledge abundance, when knowledge is a river, not a reservoir, a process, not a product. And when we know that in 2006, so already the proportion, if you're a knowledge worker, the proportion of knowledge that you have right there in your brain is around 10%. And 90% of what you need to know is going to come from others, other humans, or increasingly other machines. That's forced a change from expert to facilitator. And that makes even more sense in the context of peer learning. And that shift from expert to facilitator is something that is not new. You can see this is citing an article by Foley in 2008, but it's crucial to understanding the power of peer learning. So you have the old learning and the new learning, and that leads to the formulation of a kind of a realization that when you combine these different types of learning into a new form of learning, you get all of these affordances, literally things that you can afford to do that were either difficult or impossible to do in the past, and that's an agenda for new learning. You have things like ubiquitous learning. That's what people most easily understand about digital, but there's also things like recursive feedback, something that good teachers have always done. But in a new learning context, formative assessment can become continuous and can be done by peers, which means it can be done at scale. We'll come back to that. Now, we could deep dive into the rabbit hole of learning theory. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to focus on practical examples now of peer learning systems that we've actually built at the Geneva Learning Foundation. We started in 2016 with 3 initiatives. Won't go into the first one, which is our own program to teach others our a unique pedagogical approach. Ambulance was an initiative with the Red Cross, Red Crescent, mobilizing pre-hospital emergency care providers, ambulance workers, and what we found, and this statement by Christina Guerrero exemplifies that we're able to foster changes in mindfulness, considered the sort of higher order learning that is typically considered, most people would say, impossible to achieve by digital means. But digital combined with social and peer learning made it possible. Now, we worked with the World Health Organization initially to build peer courses, fairly conventional technical courses on technical knowledge, but with the peer learning component built in. We've done 46 cohorts of such courses with WHO, specifically on immunization as well as other areas. And the first evaluation in January 2019 found that these are more than just courses. They foster and improve practice at every level. And we looked at what part of the course was able to do that. It was that combination of peer learning, social learning, and of course, the fact that it was digital. In July 2019, building on these results, we launched the first Impact Accelerator. 644 scholars, alumni of our programs, signed a pledge to actually achieve impact. We saw something remarkable happen. And keep in mind the point about learning architecture. This is in physical space, but these individuals, many did not know each other, were not working together in any way, and all of a sudden, 644 of them were collaborating. You can see there's a lot of dialogue. You can see there's a configuration where there's that connotes something very different from that conventional industrial age classroom. We are together became a slogan for the individuals involved. This was above and beyond our expectations, but completely consistent with these recent advances in learning science. The Impact Accelerator is a human knowledge network. It unites scholar alumni in a shared pledge to turn knowledge into action. Now, what we saw following that Impact Accelerator when we went back in January 2020, we had a control group, which were the people who had also done a course, also developed a project, but had not participated in this collective, collaborative, peer, social, remote learning effort. And we found a startling difference between who had actually made progress and who did not. Now, when we analyzed a later program, Teach to Reach in 2020, again, this is where we really crystallized that it's a combination of different types of learning that was able to generate such startling outcomes. We then formulated this continuum of action from knowledge to impact and position specific interventions and specific activities. What the learners get to do that could help drive progress at each stage in that continuum, at each that led us to formulate what we call the full learning cycle. And this is a series of peer learning exercises, field-based practice, focused not on teaching you content, but on helping you solve your most urgent problems and then accessing content as a resource in that problem solving. So really turning that equation of content-driven learning on its head. So tangible example, movement for immunization agenda. We launched a call to join this movement. We moved from a course metaphor to a movement metaphor, 7th of March 2022. Within 4 months, we saw over 6,185 people move from knowledge to action, with over 1,000 developing action plans and over 4,000 joining the Impact Accelerator. So we saw startling, and within 3 months, we saw 30% of the cohort that had developed action plans report that they had completed, successfully implemented their local project plans. That led us to formulate that we see no magic bullets, but we do see an opportunity for transformation that may be much harder to achieve, but with a far greater return on the investment. And that is by empowering health professionals to drive improvement from the ground up, connecting them to their peers and linking to global guidance. Now, we would differentiate peer learning to join forces, to build alliances between global and local partners toward global partner goals. And here, for example, with UNICEF, we're working for the next 4 years on topics such as how to identify and reach zero-dose children. And in order to better understand that, UNICEF comes to us to engage, comes to this community of change makers, over 60,000, that are under the banner of the Movement for Immunization Agenda 2030. But the key is not so much. Another example would be the collaboration with Bridges to Development. Ruth Allotey will be telling you all about that. But the key point is that it's not so much the relationship that learners, local actors have with the Geneva Learning Foundation or even with UNICEF or Bridges to Development. It's about the connections they build with each other. And that is what peer learning means if we want peer learning systems to be effective. Hence, we're most excited by seeing peer learning increasingly driven by the needs and priorities of practitioners themselves. For example, within this full learning cycle, a group of women who work in vaccination formed a collective of women who deliver vaccines and are now leading discussions on how to make HPV vaccination work for women and girls. Second example is a manifesto for global health. Over 1,300 health practitioners have co-authored a manifesto in which they express their perspective in their terms and with no international agencies or international consultants involved. The third example, and this is something that we initiated, but the response showed us that there's really something there, and that's the health impact for local communities on the front lines of climate change. We asked 1,234 people who responded if climate change is a threat to the health of the community I serve, and this was explicitly asked to them as health professionals. You can see the responses here. The highest threat level, almost half of the group ascribes that level to the threat. So around these different initiatives, whether they're partner-driven or locally driven, we've built the Knowledge to Action Hub. And this is really, again, building on the full learning cycle, but as new knowledge is generated, systematically capturing it, making sense of it, and rather than putting it into containers, building that river of knowledge that practitioners can tap into with many different paths to action and trying to meet them where they are at the point of need. What's the point? If health workers do not share their challenges and solutions, we're bound to fail. That's from a participant at our Teach to Reach initiative. And yeah,